The world is big and dangerous, and there's not much reason to love it, especially if you live in a dormant jungle of glass and concrete, populated by people indifferent to everything but their own skin. In the sticky web of daytime streets and under the rays of icy neon light at night. Such was the fate of the hero of this story, searing anger and hatred toward the reality around him. What else can you expect when a child is abandoned as soon as he is born? When they treat them all their lives as if they had been raised as slaughter animals. There are not many options left. Either surrender, let everything go on its own and die, or to become stronger, clinging to the possibility of survival, and not trust people, no matter what happens. Be a loner. It culminated in an ordinary walk through the city, but it ended in a confrontation with 3 opponents at the same time. Too confident. They were counting on easy prey when they rounded up a slender kid in a dark sweatshirt. They knocked him to the ground with powerful blows that rained down from all sides. But no one expected him to get up. He wiped his bloody face and shouted furiously, attracting the attention of his opponents, who had already begun to retreat. And then he would attack and, with a series of lightning strokes, smash the smug faces of his opponents in blood and break the teeth of the hapless thrill-seekers. Even the board one of them was holding in his hands didn't help. The opponents were left lying on the asphalt, moaning while they tried to figure out what had happened. And their failed trophy put on his hood, gave the place a contemptuous glance, and walked away. But this case was soon forgotten amidst much bigger problems. After all, on January 1, 2020, the world turned into a game and was filled with dungeons, bright portals, from which all sorts of monsters began to emerge on Earth. Goblins, orcs, skeletons that suddenly came to life for unknown reasons, bloodthirsty werewolves, and even voracious dragons. Big cities were plunged into total chaos. Fire and destruction filled them with the many deaths of ordinary citizens. Bodies filled the streets. Blood poured in rivers over the once gray asphalt. And over the fires was the suffocating stench of soot and decay. It seemed that hope had abandoned this world, until divine beings began to appear in it, and they began to be called Shining Ones. The light of the distant stars emanated from the huge humanoid figures, and they themselves transmitted their power to a small group of people. Thanks to these abilities, the lucky ones learned how to destroy dungeons and transform themselves into players. People believed that the players who possessed special powers would save the world. After all, there was nothing else left but that hope. And who better to count on than heroes capable of single-handedly slaying a giant troll and thereby inspiring the admiration of the crowd? Except that the players took advantage of the chaos around them and were only busy lining their own pockets with money. And more talk about the end of the world began to circulate among the common people. But the hero of the story was not interested in talk. After all, the world as he saw it was still a place in which no one could be trusted. Until, by chance, he met Si-Jun Lee, one of the first 7 players, an invincible warrior, heir to the sacred light, and the strongest player in the world. He unselfishly helped all those who needed protection from the bloodthirsty monsters of the many dungeons. And so he earned the love and adoration of all the common people. For the sake of saving the world, Si-Jun Lee, like the hero of the legend of King Arthur, drew his sword from the stone, and with it he began to destroy the numerous evil that disturbed the peace of the commoners. The heir of the sacred light set himself the goal of destroying all the monsters the game had created, to put an end to the endless raids of the monsters, and thus save his world from destruction. Si-Jun Lee created the Messiah Guild to gather under its banner brave men who wanted the same thing. This was the first time such a thing had happened, and the hero of this story also decided to join their ranks, finally meeting people he could trust. The soldiers, led by a blonde knight in shining armor, had many hard battles ahead of them. And after the battles, the warriors, tired but satisfied with their victories, could rest in a tavern. And, looking at such a picture, the hero of this story smiled softly, feeling his own involvement in something more than endless loneliness. Together with the other members of the guild, he hoped to be able to change the world for the better. And the possibility of that was slowly approaching. For now, the guild had a final goal, a final battle, after which life could finally go back to the way it used to be. However, these plans were not destined to come to fruition. Before the fight, the hero decided to go to the Temple of the Sacred Light, where he knew Si Junli was now, and spent time praying for victory. Chapter The Last Battle is Left. A member of the guild spoke softly to the leader, to which the latter indefinitely hummed, which caused mute puzzlement fellow. The last battle. Yes, perhaps it will be the last. The next second he drew his sword from its sheath and plunged it into the body of his hapless comrade in arms. The sharp metal ripped through the sturdy armor like thin tin, plunged into the body at the hilt, and ripped a desperate cry from the victim's throat. Well done, Woo Jin Kim. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have been able to accomplish all this. Se-jun Lee sarcastically stretched out and stepped away from the warrior, who had fallen to his knees, and then put a Balmune curse on him, and it almost completely removed the player's resilience and protection. Was it from the beginning? Have you been plotting this? Woo Jin Kim grunted with difficulty and clutched at the floor of the temple with his fingertips in rage. But why? He was answered by quiet footsteps and the voice of another companion, who suddenly came closer, and then the girl mockingly muttered, "Why? Don't you still understand? When the game ends, everything will be gone. Our power, the items, the dungeons, the monsters." After explaining her own motives to her dim-witted colleague, she approached the heir of the Sacred Light, lightly tapped his shoulder pad, and added, "The reason to honor us will also disappear." Shin Hai Park. Woo Jin Kim breathed out with difficulty and looked at the girl in disbelief. She leaned toward his ear and whispered, "We can't even take over the world." Because of that phrase, Woo Jin Kim found the strength to raise his head and glare furiously at the guild members with whom he had to go through so much, and shouted the name of its head, then coughed up the black slime that hissed on the stone floor. Shinhee Park watched his suffering for a while. She couldn't hide her surprise or even delight as she began to speculate that the now unnecessary comrade in arms was really cool, since Balmun's curse had only caused the poisoning. After all, it was only enough poison for the others to cease to exist. At these words, the black-haired warrior's eyes began to flicker to the faces of the men he'd fought alongside. The men had disappeared without a trace, leaving no clue as to their fate. This made Woo Jin Kim feel wildly angry, slamming his fist into the stones of the floor and screaming that he believed in the guild members and wanted to save the world, that now he was in the way, and so they decided to get him out of the way, just like the other colleagues with whom he had risked his own life together. After that, the guild leader and his girlfriend left, and Woo Jin Kim shouted after them that the heir of the Sacred Light should at least try to make excuses for his own actions and voice them with his shitty and vain mouth. But no one would listen to him. The warrior swore and finally caught himself thinking that no one in this world could be trusted, and then he fell to the cold floor, ended his existence, and at the same time started a new game. Other people's voices were annoying. They belonged to different people, because there was no other way to explain the differences in intonation and timbre. And they weren't talking about the same things. Some wondered if it was necessary to go back to some pudge, and persisted in saying that the monsters were appearing too often. Some, no less insistently, advised me to shut up and not complain. Some, in human nature, rejoiced at the fact that they could still make money today. Others worried that their lives were at stake, and that they should be paid more for such work. Then the light at the end of the tunnel flashed in my field of vision. and it was real. And then a truck flew out of the tunnel at full speed. In the back of the truck, Woo Jin Kim suddenly came to his senses and immediately began to look around. Next to him sat the men whose voices he heard. The companions, like the boy himself, wore dark blue uniforms and body armor. Then Woo Jin Kim started groping for himself, causing the men traveling with him to sneer. And he began to think about what had happened. He was stabbed to death by Balmun, causing the brunette to depart safely into the next world. But it didn't feel like a dream at all. And then the young man remembered the place where he was now. Meanwhile, the truck driver hit the brake pedal sharply and pressed it to the floor, which caused the car to skid, and the sharp sound of tires scraped against the asphalt spread across the road. The reason for such an abrupt stop was several flaming cars, over which columns of black smoke and soot were rising. Bodies were lying around the cars. But even that wasn't the worst of it. After all, there was a crowd of orcs near the battered cars, which the driver immediately reported and ordered everyone to leave the body with their weapons at the ready. The orcs reacted to this too, and rushed to the new, as they thought, prey. At the same time, they roared and grinned furiously, causing the driver to shout nervously and demand that the passengers move. The men immediately began to follow orders while their commander gave a brief briefing. The point of the briefing was that the men didn't have much ammunition. Therefore, they should only fire when they were sure they would not miss. However, a few seconds later, he was interrupted by the dumbfounded shouts of the fighters. This reaction was caused by the fact that Woo Jin Kim did not wait for the end of the briefing and moved forward. Afterwards, he shot at the nearest enemy. The green-skinned monster collapsed on the pavement and poured blood from the hole in his head. Meanwhile, the brunette fired another round, which immediately found another target. The other orcs were not happy about it. They immediately pounced on the overly bold man and used their heavy clubs, but that did not save them, for the bullets were faster than muscle strength, even if it was monstrous. The last warrior of the orc squad was suddenly alone and managed only to bark something frightened. But a second later, he joined his comrades in arms, when a new shot sent him to his death. When the crackling of the machine guns subsided and the dust on the road settled, the witnesses to the orcs' massacre began to make noise. The men began talking among themselves and only stared dumbfounded at their brother, who had managed to do all the work by himself. They had never seen anything like this before that day. Woo Jin Kim himself caught himself thinking that everything around him was too real for an ordinary dream. And, in all likelihood, he was somehow in the past. The feeling was reinforced by the commander, who came up and immediately yelled at the overactive subordinate. However, the guy did not pay attention to the man and walked past him. Neither did he pay attention to the astonished exclamations of his colleagues, who were trying to understand what exactly was going on with him now. Instead, the brunette went back to the car. He settled down on some crate beside it, sighed, and plunged into his memories. The faces of Sejun Lee and Shinhai Park immediately flashed before his eyes, causing a vicious grimace to appear on their victim's face. But Woo Jin Kim didn't have time to think about the betrayal for long, because he was plucked from his poisonous thoughts by the piercing sound of an announcement that came literally out of nowhere. It said that he was now a gambler. The entire field of vision was immediately occupied by a glowing window, which shimmered in all shades of blue, with 3 possible choices of development in the game. One of them didn't get any attention, neither in the past nor now that by chance Woo Jin Kim is in it again. After all, he had never been interested in the role of an archer. He had chosen the role of stern fighter for life the last time, and became a warrior who was very skillful with sword and shield. But he didn't want to make the same mistakes again. So the brunette rejected that option as well. But he did not have a third choice before. For this reason, the young man, second to the one day he had already lived, decided to focus on this one. The role of a representative of the dark world. This role gave you the ability to control different types of curses, or use dead monsters as material and create a dark army. Unlike the other classes, it gave cheating abilities. After all, the player who followed this path could gain all the skills. The most powerful player who received the favor of the Dark World spokesman and all of his abilities was Johann George, the so-called Immortal King. At the time when Si-Jun Lee was a hero, the Immortal King was among the monsters. And in order to find this monster, Woo Jin Kim decided to choose precisely the role of the representative of the Dark World, and with a soft clicked on the right glowing window to do so. To become a monster and thus begin his own hunt. Since the emergence of the dungeons and the heroes who began to fight their spawn, various guilds began to emerge all over the world. They were commercial organizations created with the aim of gathering under their banners players who were united by one or another ideology. Of all the organizations of this kind, the Phoenix Guild stood out. It was different in that its members could get money and power in any way they had the strength to do, and at the same time do not care about the correctness of their own methods. This approach made the Phoenix the second most powerful guild in Korea, against the background of the corruption that was spreading in its ranks. The Messiah Guild made a perfect impression. The Phoenix Guild headquarters was located in a fairly ordinary skyscraper. There were plenty of such buildings in this reality. The more so since it was much more convenient to accept new recruits in an office environment. That's where Woo Jin Kim went. An important-looking man was waiting for him in the sunlit office. He immediately handed the boy a contract to join the Phoenix Guild with a quiet rustle. And then he began to tell him that every sweep of the dungeon entailed additional expenses. Brunette immersed himself in studying the documents, after which he came to the conclusion that it was clearly not enough to buy certain items that were needed for the game. But there was nothing to be done in this situation. When the young man had finished reading, he asked how he could prove his own qualifications as a player. After all, only he himself could see the windows of state, while other people had no such ability. His interlocutor grinned at this and straightened his jacket, then handed him several pages of Dark World skills. The guild candidate had to choose one of them and then tear it apart to prove his abilities. Thanks to this, the office worker got an opportunity to see everything with his own eyes. A representative of the Dark World from level 1 and up, it consisted in the fact that the blood of its owner turned into poison. Its destructive power increased along with the growth of the skill rank and the level of the player himself. Resisting the effects of the poison was extremely problematic. It was a fairly simple skill. However, when I was able to summon and work with blood golems, its effect increased noticeably. This made it an incredibly useful ability. After a moment's hesitation, Woo Jin Kim chose a sheet of paper with the hemotoxin skill on it, took it in his hands, and immediately tore it up. The office was filled with a bright flash of sapphire light, which caused the guild member to adjust his glasses again and replace his contemptuous grin with a grimace of surprise, bordering on fear. The representative of the Dark World himself saw the status window, which informed him that he had acquired a new skill. The morning after the confirmation of the player's qualifications, the boy woke up not without difficulty, and immediately plunged into thinking about the fact that he had once already ceased to exist in this world. But for some unknown reason he was reborn again, though dreams of his former life still haunted him. It was from one of these that the young man awoke. He was dreaming of his former associates and one of the many sweeps of dungeon. In the course of it, the blonde, violet-eyed sorceress had the temerity to ask another colleague, the muscular, razor-headed warrior, why Woo Jin Kim had been chosen as a bloodhound. After all, his class was not well suited for such a role. To this, the knight whispered that of all the guild, their commander had the most canine character. The girl gave a surprised exclamation. Then her interlocutor explained that the sorceress herself would see that he was right, if she stayed in the company of the commander long enough. At this point, Woo Jin Kim woke up, and he caught himself thinking that if he somehow managed to be in the past, his comrades in arms must still be alive. and he might even be able to meet them. The only question was when that meeting would happen. Meanwhile, in the Gwangmun Sports Park, another event began. In the underground parking lot of the place, guarded by armed men, 4 players gathered. A dark-haired girl, a smiling blonde in a red turtleneck, and a brunette in a gray coat. A shaved-headed man in a white shirt greeted them. He immediately asked if everyone had gathered early today. The gray-eyed young lady made a worried look on her face and spoke timidly about the fact that today was their first hunt, and that, in all likelihood, they should just trust a man named Jusup. He said confidently that this was his 4th trip to the dungeons, so the rest of the guys should really trust him and just follow him. After that, the man asked when the last member of today's hunt would arrive. The response was an unimaginable rumble. It was coming from a car that had some difficulty pulling into the parking lot. Witnesses to its appearance were dumbfounded. Unlike the other cars that had been left in the parking lot, this one was old as hell, and it kept spewing puffs of smoke into the air, as if it might just fall apart on the move at any moment. The blonde man watched for a while, and then grimaced as if he'd taken a bite of half a lemon at once, and began to reason about what the driver of the vehicle had said about this being his first hunt. But he was beginning to get annoyed by his slowness, and in general, this rookie needed to become more disciplined. At the same time, the car finally stopped, and then Woo Jin Kim, dressed in his usual sweatshirt, almost fell out of it in front of the participants of the future hike. The girl began to look at her future co-conspirator, after which she grinned contemptuously and agreed with the blonde, and then said that the kid who had come here in his wreck should be grateful that they'd let him join the outing in the first place. Also, she characterized the last car as terrible. Next, the brunette joined the conversation. He said that, judging by the newcomer's appearance, he hadn't even had time to get his guild gear, and, it seems, he decided to focus only on survival during his first operation. But then this conversation was interrupted by Jusup. The man suggested that his colleagues simply forget about the new guy, and pretend that they were missing one member. Then the skinhead began to talk on the fly about the new weapon he had recently purchased. The others took his idea with enthusiasm, followed their mentor, and left the last classmate behind. After that, the team went to the guild office, where a brief briefing on dungeons was given to its members. It was about the things that were not mentioned in the briefing. That did not matter. All that mattered was to remember the purpose of each mission and the conditions under which it was to be carried out. The location to which the newcomers were to go today was the Goblin Cave. It had to be cleared of all monsters, and when the main task was over, the office worker reminded the men to double-check everything. If any of the fighters had any questions or decided to refuse the mission, they had to say so now. If there were none, all the players had to check their equipment again. The rest of the team reacted to this advice very lightly and immediately started joking and laughing. And Woo Jin Kim caught himself thinking that he didn't know any of the players, so he didn't have to worry about any of them. Next came the command that the players could enter the dungeon, and all the players headed toward the glowing portal that led to the location they were to sweep. As they approached it, a girl excitedly rambled on about how this was the first time she'd ever seen the crossing. So close. And Jusup mockingly replied that she would be even more surprised when she was in the location itself. Woo Jin Kim reacted the most calmly to the portal. The hunt was already underway in the dungeon, where the glowing gap led. Upon arriving in the other dimension, the dark-haired girl, who was in fact a witch, exclaimed in amazement that she had indeed entered the other world, and immediately she began to look around in rapt fascination at the age-old forest in which the players had been trapped. The blonde guy, who turned out to be an archer, mumbled about how he felt like he was in some computer game. He was interrupted by Jusup, who snarled that it wasn't a game at all, but real reality. He was in the middle of a game. Woo Jin Kim, meanwhile, paid little attention to the chattering of his forced classmates. He concentrated on looking around the immediate area for traces. He found many trees that had been torn apart by someone's sharp claws, and he came to the conclusion that the entire dungeon was literally crawling with goblins. When he was done with that, Jusup called him over and offered to take a look around while the others set up camp. The young man calmly agreed and left the clearing where the other players had settled. They immediately began discussing their comrade in arms who had gone into the woods. The archer grumbled that he was sure his forced colleague was clingy, but he fell for the commander's ploy surprisingly easily, as if he didn't know how dangerous it was, and probably just turned out to be blithely stupid. The squad leader listened to this monologue for a while, but then he got bored. Then the shaved-headed swordsman grinned and talked about how they needed to be well prepared for the hunt, and then all the items they could find during it would belong only to them. Woo Jin Kim, on the other hand, didn't go far all this time, and now he was speculating that the commander's use of him as bait was entirely expected. And then the gambler grinned predatorily and began to consider his actions for the future. The full moon stood out brightly against the sky, which seemed bottomless at this time of day. It was a silver light that diluted the inky darkness of the city at night, and the skyscraper that housed the guild's office, called Messiah, was brightly illuminated. The dark room had several tall windows through which the moonlight penetrated. The room was lit by a circle of blue light on the table, where the guild members sat in high throne like armchairs. Shinhee Park was the first to speak, as she had new information for the rest of her colleagues. And now that everyone was here, she asked for permission to introduce the new member for the next mission. The large man, who was sitting at the same table with the girl, decided to clarify exactly who he was talking about. A second later, he turned around when, beside him, in a patch of bright light, falling to the floor from an unexpectedly open door, appeared the silhouette of someone's shadow. Next, Yang Ji-hoo grimaced and roared that their new guest was among the arrogant. Bastards. The guest slapped the base of his hand with the folded fan he held in his other hand. But he politely replied that it was a pleasure to meet the players who were here, and then called his own name. As it turned out, the man's name was Suzuki Ichi. After that, the guest noticed that there were many familiar faces around him, and, accordingly, it is even possible not to introduce himself. The head of the Messiah Guild, Si-jun Lee, reacted to the last remark. He grinned and said that the new member clearly had big ambitions. The newcomer, on the other hand, was impatient to clarify exactly what he was going to do. A large man with a fan in his hand stood beside him, slapped the table angrily with his palm, and shouted about how this scoundrel dared to talk to the head guild in that tone of voice. But all he got in return was a contemptuous squint. Next, the other guild members spoke up. Noda Haidaro, the master archer, and Sukahara Ken, the master swordsman, began to resent why the head had invited the bastard, whom they were now forced to listen to. Meanwhile, the large man next to whom the guest was now standing jumped up in anger, waving his hands vigorously and, at the same time, wailing in an attempt to figure out what it was all about. But the guest contradicted him by saying that everyone who was here was simply crazy. Yang Ji-hoo reached out his hand to, presumably, grab the visitor by the scruff of the neck. But the latter stopped him with a fan on his fingers and asked if the man was annoyed by his intonation, or memories of the previous time. Suzuki Ichi then squinted his eyes and asked caustically if this left him with any unpleasant residue. After that, the bully started to ask quite loudly what exactly the guild visitor had asked, and then proceeded to call him a jerk and threatened that he would finally be with him today. Another guild member, Kim Jae-hoon, agreed with him and said that their guild visitor was just a jerk. However, all the arguers were interrupted by the angry cry of the head of Messiah, who ordered to stop the wrangling. Si-jun Lee gave them a contemptuous squint, which made Yang Ji-hoo's face look frightened. After that, the player sat back in his seat and began to grumble that this was all just because of last time, and he would soon be able to beat the arrogance out of a visitor who was not too pleasant to him. Then Shinhai Park spoke again. She smiled and noted that the greetings had already been dealt with, and then asked about the work that had been agreed upon earlier, and how long the guild member would have to wait to do it. Suzuki Ichi responded by slapping his hand with his fan again, after which a glowing sword image appeared above the table, where the guild members were gathered. After that, the guest confidently stated that if it was a matter of searching for material now, it would take no more than 3 days. Si Junli quite folded his arms at this, and added that this result is quite good and quite satisfactory to him. Further events of the story unfolded already in the dungeon, where Woo Jin Kim was now going through the first, as other members of the Phoenix Guild thought, mission. The guy had climbed a rather large tree and once again found deep grooves on its bark from goblin claws. Because of this, the player was once again inclined to think that the talk about this location didn't lie, and there really are a lot of monsters here. This observation made the brunette smile predatory. After that, the young man began to speculate that the situation in which he now found himself was in some ways even amusing. After all, the type of reconnaissance and fighting style that he was now using had been taught to him by none other than Suzuki Ichi. Next, Woo Jin Kim began to recall the lessons of his mentor. He insisted that every trace contained information that would help him survive in the underworld. The apprentice didn't share his confidence and wondered if simply becoming stronger wasn't enough. However, he was reminded that this was not the most important condition. After all, no matter how strong he was, he would always have weaknesses. Then the brunette went back to examining the marks on the bark, and at the same time he thought that he had naively thought that his teacher's words would be a good lesson for him. But the mentor was not at all what the student thought he was. Suzuki Ichi has not only killed for the Messiah Guild, but has become its most loyal dog. But now all the knowledge he has taught his mentee in the past will be used against him, and will become a knife in the mentor's back. With that thought, Woo Jin Kim jumped down from the tree to the ground, and the next second he recoiled as he heard a loud whistling and a rock hitting the tree trunk. He turned around and saw 3 goblins, one of whom was swinging a sling in his hand, and the other 2 of whom were lunging at the guy with clubs, which amused him a bit and made him smile evocatively. A bluish fire erupted in the boy's hand, and then turned into a curved dagger, which he immediately sliced his hand with. After that, he smiled even wider and thought of the fact that not long ago he had to hide from goblins in the 7-story dungeons. But now these monsters were just targets for hemotoxin. The goblins, meanwhile, were rapidly approaching the follower of the Dark World, and at the same time were shrieking and waving their weapons furiously. But then Woo Jin Kim slashed one of them with his bloody knife, causing the green-skinned man to immediately foam from his mouth, and make it clear that goblins are quite vulnerable to blood poisoning. Nevertheless, the enemy still continued to strike, and the brunette noticed it. He was forced to conclude that since the goblin was poisoned and still moving, the poison wasn't working as fast as he would have liked. The next moment, however, another goblin distracted him from his thoughts. The monster jumped toward him and tried to strike him with its club, causing the boy to move out of his way as quickly as possible. Woo Jin Kim didn't wait for another attack, and grabbed the dagger and threw it. The blade stabbed the goblin squarely in the forehead, causing it to drop its snag and drop dead, while its tribesman screamed angrily again. Then he watched as the other green-skinned creatures began to gather around him, which gave the boy a wry grin. He also thought that the goblin's strategy wasn't hard to anticipate. Accordingly, it would be easy enough to deal with them too. Next, the boy extended his arm forward, and it flashed again in a bright blue light, which then turned into a long, heavy whip woven of leather. When it did, the brunette struck the goblins closest to him, sharply, knocking them to the ground and filling the air with a loud clang. Because of the effect of the Goblin King's whip, all the opponents froze in their seats and started trembling in terror, and they started tapping their teeth, almost drumming, as if they were suffering from severe chills. And Woo Jin Kim smiled thoughtfully and thought that he had not prepared the weapon in vain. A detachment of 4 Phoenix Guild players made their way through the dense forest of a goblin dungeon. At the back of the procession was an enchantress in a wide-brimmed hat with an elongated cap. The next second, she turned around as she heard a suspicious noise. As it turned out, on the heels of the players with all the speed possible rushed quite a large group of goblins, which made the face witch expression of genuine horror. The girl screamed and put her staff out in front of her in an attempt to shield herself from the goblin, who jumped up to her and was about to strike her with his heavy club, while growling loudly. A second later, however, someone else's blood splashed on the witch's face and the ground in front of her, causing the witch to be truly dazed. As it turned out, the green-skinned monster was thwarted by Jusup. The warrior struck it with his half-sword and cut it almost in half, and then yelled at the sorceress because of what she was doing, and pointed out to the girl the fact that mere goblins need not fear. The witch wept in great fright and gratitude for her mentor, and clung even more tightly to her staff. But the fair-haired archer and the black-haired warrior were genuinely delighted when they saw their eldest comrade in arms massacre what they thought was a terrible monster. Meanwhile, Jusup grinned and watched the other goblins, who were already racing toward him. The warrior also shared with his teammates that he had prepared a long sword for this mission, for nothing short of good fortune. His hapless opponents, on the other hand, were nothing more than sacks of meat. A second later, however, the smug smile on the man's face was replaced by a grimace of simultaneous fright and surprise. It was because Jusup was about to pull the sword blade out of the goblin carcass that now lay motionless on the ground. He failed, however, as the blade was surprisingly stuck. And while the warrior was trying at least somehow to solve this problem, another goblin ran up to him and hit the swordsman on the head with his club in a jump. The hard blow drove the skinhead to the ground while his sword remained protruding from the goblin's body. Next, the man frowned at his bloody face and saw more monsters rushing toward him. Then the swordsman tried to get up and turn toward his other guildmates, then yelled to be rescued, and that only complete idiots would stand and watch in such a situation. Not to say that such an order from their mentor made the new members of the Phoenix Guild ecstatic, but they had no other options now, so they began to swear and shout, but rushed to attack the green-skinned foes. Meanwhile, in another part of the dungeon, a goblin growled as well. It was interrupted quickly enough, however, as the green-skinned silencer dropped his club from his hands and practically fell in half due to someone else's blow, then collapsed to the ground. Woo Jin Kim grinned at the sight, but the other goblins stared at him with horror on their faces. He was in the middle of a fight, and then the rest of the goblins were staring at him with horrified muzzles. But the player didn't stop there and struck back with the whip. The weapon immediately found a new target and wrapped itself around the sluggish foe's neck. The goblin's fangy mouth sputtered with choking foam, and he clutched at the leather lash with his fingers before collapsing dead on the ground. After that, there was a flash of blue light around him, and a column of blue light flashed around the brunette. It happened because his level had increased. After that, a status window appeared in front of the player's eyes, informing him about the new achievement attracting attention. This made Woo Jin Kim grin quite a bit, and think that the goblins in this dungeon were much weaker than he had thought. He grabbed his whip and strode away, while the clearing he'd left was filled with bloody green-skinned bodies. The boy also noted that with so many enemies defeated, he was even beginning to attract attention. Then Woo Jin Kim took another look at the Goblin King's whip, and came to the conclusion that only fools swing heavy swords, while his weapons were enough to clean up this dungeon, and that, on the whole, there was no point in wasting time here anymore. Meanwhile, the rest of the Phoenix Guild was sitting on the ground after their skirmish with the goblins, bickering wearily. The black-haired knight, with his face bloody from the fight, hesitantly wondered what might have happened to the newcomer Jusup had sent to survey the area. The swordsman, who had already had a bandage put on his club-injured head, replied in a crushing manner that, since he had not been heard from yet, he was probably dead. The witch hugged her arms tightly around herself and shuddered. The archer, on the other hand, got very angry and started screaming that it would have been much better if someone else had been with them. After all, he had done just as Jusuf had said, but in the end, things were not as rosy as their mentor had promised. The swordsman responded by cursing at his charges, who accused him of lying to them, by and large. However, a few seconds later, the quarrel was interrupted by another goblin invasion. Because of this, the most senior member of the squad exclaimed disbelievingly that this could not be, but there was no time to think about it. The players stood back to back and prepared their weapons for another battle, even though they were trembling with terror. Meanwhile, in another part of the location, Woo Jin Kim once again destroyed another squad of goblins. The creatures fled from him, and the player aptly stopped them with a flexible whip, and then was able to get another level upgrade. But after that, something unexpected happened. The guy received a message about acquiring a new skill called Skeleton Warrior. He was very surprised by this, and immediately called up a reference book to see which skill was mentioned in the status window. And as soon as the glowing book appeared in front of him, he began to read. Next, Woo Jin Kim took the skill page in his hand and thought incredulously that acquiring such a skill was a real stroke of luck. After all, it was possessed by Johann Jorg, the immortal king, who could control an army of the dead with his own hands. Summoning skeleton warriors was his strongest skill, but, on the other hand, this skill was imperfect, which was a major mistake for the immortal king, and allowed, in the end, him to be dealt with. Moreover, it was only possible to sacrifice creatures that were killed by the caster to create a skeleton. But there were other great limitations to the ability. After reading the information about the new available skill, Woo Jin Kim smiled and decided that such a skill would at least save him some time. And then he ripped open the skill page, whereupon he received a notification about the new ability. Then the brunette thought, quite rightly, that now it would be much easier for him to distract his enemies and hunt them down at the same time. So he moved toward the nearest goblin body, in order to test his newfound ability. Next, the boy stretched his arm over the carcass of his defeated foe, causing a bright light to burst between it and his palm, like puffs of smoke. Under its effect, the goblin's flesh began to decay like shreds of old cloth in the wind. When all that was left of the body was bones, Woo Jin Kim began to stare thoughtfully at the skeleton that had slowly risen from the ground, and was staring at its creator through the gaps in its skull. And he caught himself thinking that he definitely liked the ominous blue gleam in the dead entity's eyes. Still, the dungeon that the Phoenix Guild unit had fallen into was certainly beautiful. There was a colorful forest, rich in greenery, and a bright blue sky, and even high mountains whose slopes rose picturesquely above all that natural diversity, in which, nevertheless, one could easily die. Woo Jin Kim, however, was not busy contemplating the deadly beauty of the location in which he was, or was not, fortunate enough to find himself. He was watching the goblin skeleton he had summoned use some kind of sword to take out some not-so-lucky tribesmen. At the same time, the hero had to deal with the fact that his ward was not as strong as he had initially assumed. After all, the brunette's magical powers were too low. And then the boy began to think how he could influence this unfortunate circumstance. Meanwhile, the skeleton turned to the necromancer who had created it, and the brunette walked over to the dark creature and patted its smooth skull, and then muttered that it would be difficult enough to use his creature as a primary weapon. After that, the brunette stared at something he didn't expect to find, namely the remains of other players who had had the misfortune to enter this location long before him. And he noted the resemblance of the rotting bodies that hung from the tree to the puppets. Then the boy began to examine his find in more detail. He came to the conclusion that all monsters, from the weakest goblins to the strongest dragons, had one thing in common, and that was that all monsters from the dungeons wished to harm humans. But, unfortunately, Usually newbies don't take this fact into account, for which, more often than not, they pay the price when they find death. Then Woo Jin Kim thought to himself that in this case, he had no reason to be merciful to these monsters. So he moved toward the tunnel in the mountain he saw nearby, and the faithful skeleton replaced following his maker. At the same time, the other 4 members of the Phoenix Guild were sitting on the floor of some cave around a small fire. Jusup began to grumble about how they'd only gotten goblins. The witch cried again, and the archer asked his tutor what they should do now. And then he added grudgingly that they'd clearly underestimated the dungeon they were in. The warrior with the bandaged head talked about how he couldn't die like that, and wouldn't lose to the damn green-skinned freaks. And then he jumped to his feet and yelled that they couldn't all die in this location. The archer froze in shock at his action. The sorceress began to wipe the tears that gushed from her eyes with renewed force, and the black-haired warrior mumbled his mentor's name fearfully. Meanwhile, the swordsman continued to shout. He asked what was wrong with his comrades in arms, and angrily added that despite the complexity of the situation they were in, it was still possible to cope with it if they tried. Except the blonde muttered that that wasn't what he was talking about, and pointed his finger at something above the senior teammate's head. He lifted his face up and asked what exactly the archer was talking about. And the fair-haired man jumped up from the ground, causing the swordsman to repeat the question. At the same time, the other members of the squad were staring upward fearfully. Jusup followed their lead and saw the blue light on the sign about the level increase. This fact raised a lot of new questions about what exactly was going on, because the warrior was not in combat at the moment. However, after a couple of seconds, the man came to the conclusion that the level is raised only when someone from the team is fighting. Accordingly, the newcomer who had fought off their squad was still alive. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim was walking down the tunnel with a torch in his hand. Ahead of him, he saw goblin bodies and a large pile of logs. Next, the necromancer thought that from his experience, the most effective way to deal with a crowd of goblins was to set them on fire. This thought brought a predatory grin to the boy's face, and then the player threw his torch into the pile of timbers, causing the mountain of old wood to quickly catch fire and illuminate the entire tunnel space with purple fire and begin to fill it with acrid, dark smoke. The goblins in the cave quickly sensed this and began to sniff to understand the nature of the suffocating smell. But then they were no longer bothered by it. The monsters began coughing and falling to the ground, as the stench made them short of breath, and the more comprehensible creatures ran away to escape the poisonous smoke. The green-skinned monsters were unaware that their way was blocked by the burning barricade that Woo Jin Kim and his skeleton had set on fire, and was now behind. The goblins began to bang against the obstacle, and in doing so, screamed in a frantic attempt to break through it, or at least somehow get out. The brunette on the other side of the barrier smiled and decided that this way he could at least bury the fallen players along with the monsters who had taken their lives, and continued to watch as the fire consumed the evil creatures one by one. And the glow of the fire became visible almost all over the dungeon. After that, Woo Jin Kim saw a new status window. It reported that the Dark World representative was satisfied with the cruelty the guy had shown to his opponents. Then player frowned at the fire and thought that the situation was rather strange, because the guy expected at least to see the face of the head of the local goblins. After that, the brunette turned away from the fireplace and walked in the opposite direction to find his main adversary, and the skeleton followed him. As soon as this happened, the remains of the burned timbers rattled, causing the skeleton to look around in fright and see a huge green-skinned monster, which broke the floor of the cave with its weight. Shards of stone fell on the undead's head, and meanwhile the monster grinned its crooked fangs. Woo Jin Kim unfolded his whip and grumbled about how he had waited a long time for the main enemy to appear, and was even starting to get tired of the place. Then the guy squinted and thanked the chief goblin for showing up on his own, and not even having to look for him for a long time. and the dungeon boss rose to his full height and stared back with a burning gaze. The huge goblin grinned, its mouth full of curved fangs, and began to climb out of the gap in the cave floor, so that with an equally impressive club, he could get the chance to deal with the troublemaker. However, Woo Jin Kim didn't seem the least bit frightened by this. Instead, the boy began to remember that before the Messiah Guild intervened in this matter, millions of newcomers had died in the dungeon, which now also included the necromancer and the skeleton he had summoned from oblivion. The culprit of this circumstance was a green-skinned monster, because in a location with enemies of the first level, meeting with the hidden Goblin King is tantamount to the end of the game, which stands on the line of life. Then the young man waved his hand, and a bright white light flashed in his palm, turning into a sharply honed sword a few seconds later, and at the same time, he decided that he would no longer allow the bloodthirsty monster to take the lives of other players. As soon as the weapon appeared in the dark-haired mage's palm, the skeleton looked back at his maker with interest, and began to shift impatiently from foot to foot. The fact that his ward was so eager to fight was rather surprising, which the lad even asked the little undead about. But the skeleton only growled and jumped up and down, like a guard dog that saw a thief or other intruder in its territory. Next, the bone creature looked back at the boy, and a menacing blue fire flashed in his eyes, subtly resembling two small ball lightning bolts. Woo Jin Kim couldn't help but notice this, which he even told the skeleton, and smiled in surprise at the same time. Finally, the boy handed his sword to the little warrior, and stepped aside, then folded his arms across his chest, leaned his shoulder against the trunk of a tree, and watched the aggressive creature. The Goblin King, on the other hand, grinned his head contentedly and roared something that sounded remotely like a mixture of snarling and laughter. The bony fighter stomped his foot irritably at this, and thus assumed a more stable position, and then he rushed out of the way, causing the huge foe to be first dazed and then disappointed, because compared to the miniature and very agile skeleton, he was very clumsy himself. The undead, meanwhile, got under the monster's feet and turned sharply, and then, with swift and strong enough sword strokes, she began to cut the main goblin of the dungeon's leg tendons, spraying thick blood in all directions. The brunette's skeleton tactics made him dumbfounded, and then, unexpectedly for himself, plunged into memories from the past, in which he fought among the ranks of the Messiah Guild. Their squad was then faced with a huge monster that looked like a fire-breathing dragon, only without wings. The ground beneath the monster's massive paws was ablaze with almost hellish fire, sparks flying in all directions and falling on the frightened faces of the other members of the squad. My companions looked at the enemy and began to shout amongst themselves, trying to figure out how exactly they could defeat a very dangerous foe. Because of its great height, its tremendous strength, and the wall of fire that spread out in waves in every direction, the monster gave the impression of total invulnerability. However, Woo Jin Kim unexpectedly came up with a solution to this problem, and ordered his teammates to attack the legs of the huge monster. After all, if they succeeded in knocking the monster to the ground, their chances of winning would skyrocket. Then the warrior drew his sword from its sheath and gave his opponent a tense squint. And then he rushed to the attack, ran up to the massive paws of the bloodthirsty reptile, and began to chop them. The brunette tried to put all his strength and weight into each blow, which soon enough he managed to cut through the tough scales, and blood poured to the ground from the broken vessels of the blade. At the same time, the other comrades in arms followed the boy's example, and began to kick the monster in the legs as well, rendering it completely immobile. Then the necromancer woke up from his memories and continued to observe the skeleton's further tactics, first knocking the Goblin King to one knee with a series of swift blows, and then dropping him on the stones of the cave. The brunette's eyes widened in surprise at the sight, and in the movements of the bone warrior, which he used to leap to deal with the monster, He recognized his own style of combat. Next, the boy rubbed his chin, chuckled, and wondered about the skeleton maid's fighting strength. He had assumed that his own strength would affect the undead, but he never thought that the dark creature would copy his style of movement. The last thought even brought a predatory chuckle to the mage's face. And then he remembered the fact that before he returned to the past, he had been free to handle almost any kind of weapon that existed, and that even in the Messiah Guild there were at most a few people who could fight him one-on-one. The skeleton, meanwhile, threw a questioning look at the creator. The necromancer replied that at this rate he would have to reconsider his plan. Then, however, it was time for the brunette to be surprised. First, a bright white light caught his attention, and then a status window appeared before the player's eyes. It said that the representative of the Dark World appreciated his achievements and was sending him a legendary skills page as a reward for his efforts. Then Woo Jin Kim clutched the generous gift in his fingers, and then grinned rather grimly and muttered that he hadn't expected to receive such a valuable purchase here. Meanwhile, in the real world, on the grounds of the Phoenix Guild, there was a real commotion. An armed soldier in a helmet and bulletproof vest shouted about clearing the dungeon, the entrance and exit of which he was guarding. The guild officer jumped up from his seat and stared at the portal, which burst into a bright blue flame that made his eyes behind his glasses even more rounded. Then, like the other guild workers, he moved rather hastily toward the portal, from which spirals of blue light streamed in all directions. And then 4 players appeared in the blinding light, one of whom was moving forward only with the help of an associate who supported him by the shoulder. As it turned out, it was the blonde man who was practically dragging his mentor around, with his head bandaged. Meanwhile, there was babble among the Phoenix Guild staff that the players were back, and the staff member who had briefed them before the mission began to yell about how this was possible, since the dungeon had already been cleared, and it had only taken a day for the fighters to do so. Next, the squad members began to be treated by the ambulance crew, and, while this was happening, the manager who had sent them to the dungeon scurried to the car. At the same time, he began to shout for the return of all the mission participants. But then the man saw his mistake and began to ask why there were only 4 of them, and where Woo Jin Kim was now. The answer was grim silence, causing the staff member to adjust his glasses and start muttering that he understood everything, and that the newcomer probably wouldn't be coming back. But rather quickly he was interrupted by a new cry that someone else was returning from dungeon. The instructor turned around in a daze, and the players froze in astonishment. Even Jusup, who was very experienced with words, could only wag his finger at the newly triggered portal in mute amazement. And he opened his mouth wide, which made his face look incredulous. In the meantime, a guy in a dark hoodie slowly emerged from a bright portal, and the office worker first called his name incredulously, and then ran closer to him, while the brunette seemed to notice neither him nor the other players who had been sent with him to sweep dungeon. The unsuccessful tutor began to argue angrily that, as he supposed, the impudent man who had successfully pretended to be a novice for all to see was still alive, and then he questioned what dirty tricks he'd used to sweep the dungeon. Woo Jin Kim gave him a surprised and then disdainful look in response, and the hapless squad leader snarled about who the bastard was to have cleared the area all by himself. The headlines of numerous newspapers were full of the new demands of the players, while the rest of the population of the planet had to continue to listen to them. So did the news, which was broadcast on every television channel. According to research, only players could sweep dungeons. For this reason, this category of people, also not too numerous, began to abuse their power in every way. As a consequence of this policy, scandals caused by the despotism of the players constantly erupted. However, among the many other guilds that have put the dungeons in business, the Messiah Guild of Korea stands out. For example, its members valiantly terminated the 5-story dungeon without any conditions or requirements. Because of this unconventional incident, the news services turned their attention to the organization of brave fighters, who, for the first time in the world, performed such a feat completely free of charge. They were discussing the identity of its leader, Sejun Lee, and the fact that the guild's sponsor, Han Seong Corporation, had seen its stock price skyrocket after successfully sweeping the 5-story dungeon. Jusup picked up the phone and saw the same headline on the screen, which caused him to growl angrily about the goddamn bastards from Messiah and how all the news was about them now. Then the man threw the phone on the table, which made a rather loud rumble. After that, the man with the bandaged head grumbled grimly about how the Phoenix members looked like freaks who did everything just for the money. But his blonde-haired, multicolored-eyed companion argued that he should forget that fact, for this was not the first time they'd been treated that way. Next, the blonde raised his glass and asked, with a white-toothed smile, what exactly had happened in the dungeon? Jusup hurriedly muttered that he didn't want to talk about it, and then reluctantly added that their entire squad had almost stayed in the dungeon forever, because of a newcomer named Woo Jin Kim. His mute companion cautiously inquired as to what had happened, and for what reason. The most experienced member of the squad poked his finger at the bandage around his head and explained that it was the newcomer's fault he'd acquired it. The blonde frowned in surprise and asked if the rumors about the newcomer were true, to which the player with the bandaged head covered his eyes with the palm of his hand and began to tell that the rookie had joined their squad at the last moment and not other than for a common misfortune. What's more, the lad was so eager to get the new dungeon items that he even ran into the goblin crowd for them. After that, the man stirred an iced whiskey into his glass and began reluctantly recounting how he had followed the newcomer to save him from the evil greenhorns. And then he got hit on the head. Blondie was genuinely outraged by this injustice, which he reported immediately, and then added that for such willfulness the guild should have punished the insolent member of their squad. Jusup responded by wistfully telling him to forget about it, and then sharing that he now felt as if he'd gotten himself into a lot of shit, and that, in all likelihood, the newcomer really needed the money, since he had acted so recklessly. But the blonde fellow disagreed and went on to insist that no matter how much money someone needed, such behavior wasn't wrong. And then he added that he would talk to his friends. And after that, the dodgy newcomer would not be able to repeat such sabotage anywhere. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim was looking at a board with various information about the Messiah Guild and a picture of its head. And then he rubbed his chin thoughtfully and began to reflect on the fact that now he didn't have to meet him in the same way as he had in the past. Next, the boy began to reason that he had to get stronger in order for the treacherous head to take an interest in him. Then he tore a page off the wall with some data, and someone's picture crossed out, and then added that he had to start in the most forgotten corner of his life. After some time, Woo Jin Kim made his way to the sunlit office of the Phoenix Guild. There he was met with a perplexed question from the manager, as he informed him of his intention to clean up the Orcish Hunter dungeon. The man went on to explain his own reaction and argued that, most likely, the guy was now trying to refute the rumors that were spreading about him in the guild, and to solve it as quickly as possible. The guy responded by wondering exactly what rumors he was talking about, and then added that he hadn't heard any rumors about himself, and just needed some money. After that, an elderly bearded man with glasses intervened in the conversation. He clasped his fingers together and carefully looked at the interlocutor, and then asked if he was going to this location just for the money. The gray-haired guildmaster went on to explain that life is priceless. Even though money is important, you should always think about that too. And then the man added that in case of extreme or urgent need of money, the guild could borrow it from its members. He was surprised that the conversation had taken such an unexpected turn, but then he stopped the older man and explained that everything was all right, and that the only thing he wanted was to be given a date for the cleanup, and that he would deal with the rest himself. At the same time, The young man thought that this inappropriate and unpleasant rumor, which had spread about him for some unknown reason, was now playing into his hands, for such slander was the perfect argument for going on a dungeon sweep alone. After talking to the Phoenix Guild staff, Woo Jin Kim left the office, and the manager informed the elderly supervisor that the rumors about this player were probably true. The man went to the window and folded his arms across his chest, and then thoughtfully countered that the rumors weren't the main factor, but that the fact that the guy didn't know his place was really annoying. Then the chief inquired about the status of the dungeon the guy was going to clean up. The answer was that a group of young Gaiyu Johns had recently gone there, but it had been a month since she died, and no one had applied to go there. This fact surprised the chief. He turned to his subordinate again and clarified exactly who the missing participant was. As it turned out, it was a very talented fighter who was a member of the gamblers group named Yong Won Park. Then the chief went back to watching the newcomer through the office window, who was just approaching his car parked nearby. And then he asked his subordinate what they should do now, because the guy was trying to get into the underground, which even the specialists could not manage to clean up. Next, the bearded man voiced his own doubts that the young player might not survive the sweep, and that the guild should at least give the boy some support, just in case. At the same time, Woo Jin Kim pulled out his phone and began to search for something on it. But then it was as if he felt a stare directed at him from the office window, and looked up to understand the nature of his own strange sensation that the alien and attentive gaze was causing. Next, the player smiled at his own thought that in order to deal with the hero, it was necessary to make friends with the villain. Then he dialed the number of a man named Yong Won Park on his phone. After the matter was settled, the brunette drove to Chuncheon City Hall. As soon as he got out of the car, a stout-looking man in a suit and round glasses, which were barely hanging on his sweaty, fast-moving face, came running up to him. The office clerk immediately inquired about the visitor's name, and then asked if the guy had really come to the place alone, which caused mute surprise on his face. At the same time, the red-haired employee caught himself thinking that the young player probably could not find partners because of his own greed for money. The man immediately led his guest to the entrance to the dungeon, and gave him a disapproving squint through his glasses on the way. And at the same time, he thought that, by and large, he shouldn't care at all about this matter, and the fact whether or not this overconfident gambler survives is not his problem at all. Next, Woo Jin Kim entered a blue-lit portal and found himself in a gray and stony location, after which a status window appeared before his eyes. It said that this dungeon had only one floor, could be visited by a maximum of 3 participants, and the sum of their levels had to be 13. The prerequisite for clearing this area was the elimination of all orc hunters. After reviewing the information about the place he found himself in, the necromancer thought that he could not clear this dungeon by himself because he was too low. But he had the option of taking out an orc and using it as material to create a skeleton warrior. And, already together with the servant, to perform this task. Next, the boy prepared his sword for the fight. And, as it turned out, he did it just in time, because the next second, a rather large orc, with fiercely glowing eyes, swooped down on him. The monster roared angrily, and had already swung its weighty club to bring it down on the head of a man unprepared for such an unexpected attack, as he had hoped. But he had spotted his opponent before, and slipped under the monster's feet, rather briskly. He then braked his hand on the stony ground of dungeon, and following his usual tactics, slashed at the orc's leg with his sword. To the young man's surprise, this time such a strategy did not work as well as he would have liked. The reason was that the seemingly ordinary orc, for some reason, had tougher skin, and a hard enough blow from a sharp blade left him with only a small scrap. Meanwhile, the monster brought his club down where Woo Jin Kim had been standing until recently, causing the rocks to shatter into rubble and fly in different directions. The player smiled nervously at this and caught himself thinking that with such force, he could cease to exist after a single blow. It would also be incredibly good to take out this orc, and then summon him as a skeleton warrior, for this action would give him a chance to sweep the dungeon alone. Next, the necromancer met the orc's angry eyes and jerked aside as he was forced to dodge another blow. This action raised another stream of rubble into the air, and one of the sharp stones even slashed the player in the face until he bled. Woo Jin Kim, however, did not pay much attention to this fact and began to rush around the orc. The orc was not aware of this fact, but Woo Jin Kim was running around the orc, scrambling around and hitting it with his legs with lightning force. The monster reacted to the dance with a bewildered expression on its fanged face, and then his severed legs buckled. The monster tumbled to the stone floor and roared, this time miserably. The necromancer stepped closer to his foe and grumbled that the legless predator was no longer so terrifying. And then he thrust his sword into his body, causing the cold stones around him to turn a rusty color from the orc's blood. When the vanquished foe finally fell silent, the skeletal warrior's summoning spell rang out. Relatively low high-rise buildings were littered with numerous advertisements and strings of wires, which gave witnesses to this landscape a feeling of screaming cheapness and poverty. In a shabby office inside one of these buildings sat two men. A man with a beard was looking at a file and grinned, then mumbled that he was holding some really interesting information. His interlocutor, a skinny guy with ash-colored hair and blue eyes, asked what exactly the older member of the conversation was staring at. And then he added grudgingly that he didn't want to hear about him trying to pick out some strange object for his business again. The man responded to this claim with a sniffle and pushed the folder across the table, which made the blue-eyed man shudder nervously, and then smugly suggested that he take a look at the data, since he was so curious. The guy followed the warden's advice and took the papers in his hands, after which he determined that he was holding some player's personnel file. But, just in case, he asked what it was. Then the gray-haired man began to read the information given to him. Then it became clear to him that the folder referred to a newcomer who had recently awakened and had already managed to clear the dungeon alone. The chief smiled and squinted carnivorously at this, and then began to tell me that this player had entered the second cave, and that this time he was alone in it to begin with, and that he was too arrogant for a man who had only recently acquired his abilities. The skinny guy was dumbfounded at the chief's words and objected that it couldn't be. After all, he himself at first had difficulties with the cleanup, and then he decided to ask if the man was going to say that he trusted some papers with information from an unknown source, and that he did not think that his manager was so naive. The blue-eyed man was answered by the clatter of his heels, and then the owner of the heels came into view. The red-haired girl was just bringing coffee and heard part of their conversation, and then decided to clarify what kind of problems arose regarding her report. The appearance of the assistant made the guy noticeably nervous and stared at the folder while trying to hide his eyes behind the papers. Next, the gambler mumbled frighteningly that since Lee's secretary had provided the data, it was no wonder why the report seemed so perfect to him. And then with feigned delight, he wondered how the employee could get such accurate information. She knocked loudly on the coffee tray, causing the contents of the cardboard cups to spill out, and the blue-eyed man jumped up from his seat. The girl, meanwhile, replied nonchalantly that it was her job. Meanwhile, the bearded man took one cup and sipped his coffee, after which he explained that this information was 100% reliable because it had been collected by Lee's secretary, and then began a moralizing reminder that if they couldn't trust this particular employee, then who was left to be trusted at all? However, after a second, the monologue was interrupted by the fact that the boss saw the empty packages of sticks and realized what kind of coffee his assistant had made, and began to shout that he had already told her not to buy instant coffee because he hated this drink, and then asked why the secretary had bought it. The girl also took a sip of coffee without any emotion on her face, and then explained that the coffee was left over from last week's meeting with the members of the Phoenix Guild. Then she pointed to her report and said that she had prepared it on the back of a paper that had already been used. After this rebuke, the bearded man made a satisfied look on his face and began to purr about how delicious it was, and how instant coffee was the best option. And then he repeated his own phrase about trusting Secretary Lee. It made the gray-haired player cringe and think that he was watching the most disgusting thing ever, especially at that age. Then he shifted his gaze to the dirty and wrinkled coffee cup. Meanwhile, the boss changed the subject of the conversation and asked the assistant how things were going with the purchase of the dungeon. The girl replied that she managed to find some good options, but the price was too high, so she continues to look. He was surprised by the turn of their conversation, so he asked which caves he was talking about, because there must still be some dungeons he hadn't yet cleared. The chief smiled beamingly, asked what his subordinate meant, and then added that if he started going into the dungeons, there wouldn't be enough of them. The guy apologized dumbfoundedly, and then clarified exactly what the chief wanted to say. And then he objected rather angrily that he had just returned from another sweep yesterday, and definitely deserved at least some rest. The boss looked serious because of this complaint and began to tell him that if he rested too often, he would soon become lazy. And then he switched to the fact that workaholics like his ward were prone to diseases, so that the man had to find new tasks for his own good all the time. In the end, the guy was very angry with this answer, but the girl sighed tiredly because of the unplanned lecture and finished her coffee. Meanwhile, there was a battle going on in the dungeon that Woo Jin Kim had gone to clean up. The orc barked angrily and grinned his drooling mouth with sharp, crooked fangs. He then struck with his club, causing the skeleton of his less fortunate counterpart to shatter and his bones to crash to the ground with a resounding thud, only to find themselves under the feet of his second opponent, who had come to the aid of his tribesmen. The necromancer watched this scene from a quieter place. He sat on the carcass of the defeated enemy and put his palms on the hilt of his sword. He also thought sadly that because of his low level of summoning skills, the undead were not as resistant to damage as he would have liked them to be. Then, however, the player had a new idea, and he deftly jumped to the ground and smiled. John George, the king of the immortals whom the necromancer had fought in a past life, told him one thing. Next, the wizard stretched out his palm and a bright blue light flashed on it, causing the orcs to turn around, and then summoned another skeleton warrior, and the servant bellowed angrily at the still living enemies, then rose to his full height behind his creator's back. The boy's eyes lit up with blue fire, and he smiled and said solemnly that as long as his magic power allowed, he would have as many skeleton warriors as the victims had fallen on this battlefield, and there were enough orc bodies on the rocky ground of the cave. Orcs from the appearance of the new undead made dumbfounded faces and roared in surprise, which echoed through the mountainous terrain of the location. Meanwhile, status windows flashed around the fighter, telling him that he had leveled up. All his skill points had increased, and that his blood poisoning skill had also reached level 2. The guy immediately started studying the glowing window, and came to the disappointing conclusion that trying to level up in this dungeon would be difficult. He also thought that he should stop fighting regular orcs and find an orc hunter instead. After these reflections, Woo Jin Kim rubbed his chin and knelt down on one knee in concentration, then began to draw with his wand on the ground a map of the location he was to sweep. As he did so, the brunette began to ponder that, as a creature that hunts alone, he assumed that the main adversary would control the entire pack. But in all likelihood, it turned out that orc hunters do not interact with the rest of the group of monsters, and there was only one place left where it can be found. He leaned over the drawing and looked questioningly at his maker, which made the brunette wonder what was wrong. It appeared that the undead knew something. That's why they were acting this way. But then Woo Jin Kim brushed aside his own suspicions and continued to speculate about the location of his main enemy, while at the same time thoughtfully scratching his head with his wand. The skeleton, too, leaned over the map and stuck his sword in the ground and the young man began to tell him that if the orc hunter was in any place, there would be no useful monsters that the necromancer could use as offerings. And the only useful skeleton warrior would be the one the mage could summon now. Then the dark-haired man tapped the branch already on the skull of the servant skeleton, and then added that he should think of some better idea, and then they both walked away. And in the place of their brief stay, there was a drawing of a map with a stick, which the player had stuck into it. In the meantime, crows had settled freely on the bones that now lay on the battlefield and were pecking at them. But then the sound ceased, because something very large was sniffing nearby, and so the birds hurried away from the danger. Then another orc appeared on the battlefield. He walked up to the dead tribesman and grabbed his bloody head, which opened the mouth of the less fortunate fellow, and sticky saliva flowed from it. Then the strange monster, with its eyes ablaze with purple fire, dragged its prey, which left a long trail of blood on the rocky ground. Please like and follow to watch more content about manhwa. Thanks. There was a loud chomping sound in the cave. It was the sound of a large orc greedily munching on a piece of meat. And next to the predator was someone's carcass, which it had already stripped of its skin. I was in the middle of a gruesome still life, and next to it was a mountain of old remains. Woo Jin Kim cautiously watched the monster from ambush. He held his bow with a bloody arrow on the bowstring, and reasoned that the dungeon boss is always stronger than all the other monsters in this location, and it would be foolish to engage him without any preparation. But you could try to pierce his body with an arrow with poisoned blood on the tip. Then the player gave a glance command to his skeleton acolyte, and the latter stepped forward with sword in hand. The dungeon boss turned over his shoulder. His eyes glowed even brighter, and he growled loudly and lunged at his new adversary. The skeleton did likewise, and brought his weapon over his head on the run to deliver a powerful blow. Then the living and dead orcs clashed, and the red-eyed foe grinned, and then snapped its predatory curved fangs into the skeleton's collarbone, causing the cave to crackle with the sound of a broken bone. While the skeletons were fighting, Woo Jin Kim stepped out into the open and took aim. At the same time, the guy thought that by the burning blood-red eyes, it was clear that it was the orc hunter who was in front of him now. But he had to avoid his overly tough skin, so he only had to aim for the one weak spot. With that thought, the player unleashed an arrow from his bowstring, and the projectile glowed blue in flight and stabbed the orc hunter right in his bloodshot eye. The orc hunter was thrown back by the force of the blow. He ran his feet over the rocky ground of the cave and piled up a mountain of rubble, and then collapsed on one knee. Then the monster grabbed the arrow by the shaft and yanked it out, then threw it to the floor of the cave. Then the monster roared angrily and breathed a cloud of steam into the air, and blood gushed from its eye. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim saw the message that the poisonous blood had affected the orc, took the bow aside, and noted the fact that the weaker the point of impact, the faster the poison spreads through the body. Next, foam spurted from the monster's mouth, causing the player who had wounded it to smile contentedly. And then another message appeared, saying that thanks to the skill of poisonous blood, the orc's health will gradually decrease. Meanwhile, the dungeon boss stared at the young necromancer in bewilderment, with a healthy eye, and collapsed already on both knees, after which he shook his head and put his palm around it. And the player noted the fact that the second level of skill hemotoxin will not increase the chance of death, but now he is quite enough, and the action that is already there. Then the skeleton servant swung his weapon over the orc hunter and struck his opponent, causing his blade to stain with blood, and the undead creator muttered contentedly that now the task was finally done. After a couple of seconds, the guy received a notification that informed him that the orc hunter was now destroyed. The dungeon was cleared. The player's level was raised, and in 1 hour he would be able to leave this location. Because the return shipment had to wait another hour, Woo Jin Kim decided to approach the pile of remains that stood next to the body of the main boss of the entire location. and noted the fact that the monster was in all likelihood gobbling up anyone who was careless enough to get in its way. The brunette then kicked one of the skulls with his foot and wondered if the mishmash of bones contained the ashes of a member of the player group named Yongwon Park. The jolt dislodged the pile of bones with a low thud. The necromancer leaned over it just in case to take a closer look at the remains, and he stumbled upon a long, even trail of blows on the ribs of one of the skeletons with a cutting weapon. Then the boy ran his hand along the trail and concluded that such an injury was definitely not caused by an orc. Then the brunette knelt down in front of the pile of remains and began to rummage through it. At the same time, he began to speculate that, judging by the appearance of the injury, the fighter whose bones he found had been attacked from behind, and it was done by someone who was already used to killing in the dungeons. It was unknown whether the killing had been intentional or not. But if it was committed by a member of the Phoenix Guild of the player group named Yongwon Park, then someone might indeed have gone for such an act because of money and items. After a couple of minutes, Woo Jin Kim exhaled a cloud of steam into the air and began to reflect on the fact that he doesn't have much time left in this dungeon. And yet he doesn't understand how to find traces of the killer. Meanwhile, the wind rose in the location and dispersed the thick clouds behind which the full moon had been hiding up to that moment. Because of its bright light, something glittered far away from where the necromancer was, and quite visibly. This made the boy curious as to whether the strange glow would help him get closer to the player named Yongwon Park. The suspicious light grew stronger, causing the mage to cover his eyes with his palm and move in the direction from which it came. Then the brunette saw a cave that until recently he had not known existed. The tunnel was small, so only one person could get into it, which Woo Jin Kim did. In a small stone nook, he found another skeleton in armor, and with a long sword in his hands. The weapon was surprisingly clean, and the remains themselves were not as badly damaged as the others. Several deep notches could be seen on the wall beside the body, indicating that while this gambler's comrades were fighting the orcs, he escaped and counted his days in this cave, until he ceased to exist. Woo Jin Kim then noticed the phoenix brooch on the dead man's cloak and grinned incredulously at his own observation, that such an act was indeed worthy of a member of the guild that had chosen that bird as its own emblem, especially if it was a rising star of the player group named Yongwon Park, as indicated by the initials Jean-I-G on the decoration. The necromancer thought that there was no place in the world more suitable for the last resting place of such a man than here. But he was distracted from thinking about this circumstance by a soft rustling with which a small book fell out of the skeleton's hands. The player was interested in the find, took it in his hands and began to leaf through it, and then was forced to come to the not-too-comforting conclusion that he found an ordinary diary, and it is hardly possible to find anything interesting. But then the dark-haired man squinted intently as he saw the blacklist of a group of players named Yongwon Park on the pages of the book, and then he closed the diary with a loud clap and smiled contentedly, as he was unusually lucky to stumble upon such a find. A status window appeared before the player's eyes, telling him that a representative of the dark world congratulated him on his dazzling achievement and sent him a legendary skill page as a gift. Woo Jin Kim grinned rather grimly at this unexpected news, because he didn't expect to get such a useful thing here. Then he took the gold-lighted page in his hands and began to read the information that was written on it. As it turned out, the necromancer had managed to obtain the rare Eye of Anubis ability, which allowed him to see into the past of the dead. Then the necromancer smiled even wider, and his eyes lit up in the glow of the page. And the gambler thought to himself that having such an opportunity in his current situation would be incredibly useful, and that, whatever failures had haunted him in his past life, things were different now. The mage then tore open the page, and a blue light flashed before him about who was talking about obtaining the skill Eye of Anubis, as well as obtaining the legendary heir achievement. Woo Jin Kim stepped closer to the Skeleton Phoenix Guild member and knelt down in front of him, only to then wrap his palms around the unlucky player's skull and smile at his own thoughts that often the dead cannot speak, but that didn't matter to him now. As he did so, his eyes lit up with blue fire, and then black flashes of smoke, like light littered them. Then smoke came from the necromancer's eyes. This was due to the fact that the player had activated the skill eye of Anubis. Next, a blinding beam of light flashed between the sorcerer's eyes and the skeleton's empty sockets, causing the cave to burst into flames, and the servant skeleton looked around in an attempt to understand exactly what had happened. Meanwhile, Woo Jin Kim began to see images that, until recently, were not in his mind and could not be. First, he heard about the bloody orcs, and then some player with a bloody face called out to Yong Gai for help and reached out to him, but the latter, instead of helping, cursed and ran in the opposite direction. Next, the fugitive saw a small cave and hid in it, after which he wrapped his arms around his head and began wailing that he must not die. Then another voice was heard, saying, fearfully, that it was a crime to hunt people. But Yangju paid absolutely no attention to such an argument. Instead, he calmly strode across the puddles of blood on the stone floor and smiled, then explained that he was in absolutely no danger as long as he had an imposing patron behind him. His unknown companion only managed to round his eyes in a frightened way and guess exactly who the guy with the scars on his face was talking about. He held his sword over him, smiled even wider, and then began to tell him who would one day own the Phoenix Guild. The last conscious image the necromancer was able to see was of a man in a chair. Given the memories of the dead man whose past the boy had been able to see, this player's name was Yong Won Park. Then flashes of black smoke reached back to the wizard's eyes, and the bright stream of light that connected them and the skeleton's empty eye sockets exploded. After the Eye of Anubis ability ended, Woo Jin Kim dropped the skull of the hapless fighter from his hands, which was the last time he told anyone his story. And then with one palm he leaned rather heavily on the ground, and with the other he put his hand around his own face and grinned painfully. Then the boy began to consider the memories of the dead man he had seen, and was forced to conclude that the latter had a very painful past, but he himself had expended far more magical power than he would have liked. After that, the gambler smiled wearily and noted the fact that his training was now complete. And if he used this information, as well as the blacklist that he had recently managed to find, he would be able to get close to a player named Yong Won Park. And it doesn't really matter how careful that person might be. Meanwhile, in the cozy and bright cottage, events of a somewhat different nature were taking place. It was not that fighting over bloody fists was a rare occurrence in these walls. Not at all. But the man who now lay on the office floor would have preferred not to face it, especially on his own skin. When the undesirable employee was asked why he allowed another player to take over the dungeon, he raised his blood-stained face and began to ask loudly for forgiveness, then rather hastily added that he would take care of him, just in case. To this, the head of the office irritatedly asked what exactly his subordinate was going to do. After all, the dungeon he couldn't handle had been cleaned out by some rookie, and after that, the employee still dares to say something like that. The chief then clarified whether or not he had been heard, and then turned to his secretary by the name of Kim. The blonde girl responded by humbly bowing her head, apologizing, and saying that she would start the task right away, while the boss continued to carefully read some newspaper. At the same time, an employee who had failed in his task was picked up and dragged away by two gloomy men dressed in business suits. Their hapless ward immediately began shouting that they should wait and not take his life, and then started begging for a second chance. But then all his cries were interrupted by the loud banging of a closed door. After that, the chief began to nonchalantly speculate that a rookie who had cleared the dungeon alone was definitely interesting, though there was nothing surprising in his actions. Next, the man asked his secretary if it was true that this player had a bad reputation in his own guild. The girl confirmed this information and began to tell about the fact that in the first dungeon, this guy had abandoned his partners. She also voiced rumors that he had appropriated all the rewards in the process, although it was impossible to verify this information. The chief mumbled thoughtfully in response that, true or not, if the guy's reputation in the Phoenix Guild was really bad, it would be hard enough to move on, because it was always impossible to clean up the dungeons alone. But then the chief's musings were interrupted by a phone call. As it turned out, a man named Woo Jin Kim had requested a meeting with the boss. The man in the white suit smiled at this, and added that the newcomer never ceased to amaze him, since he himself had come to the lion's den. After that, Yong-Won Park put aside the newspaper he had been reading until recently, and picked up the report on the applications for the AA Aegis-ranked dungeon suite. Based on the information it provided, 20 places had been allocated to the Phoenix Guild, although their number was evenly distributed this time. Meanwhile, the Phoenix Guild office was not too quiet either. The secretary was just making a report on the fact that 3 guilds, including a player guild named Yong-Won Park, were vying for the remaining 20 spots in the AI-ranked dungeon. The biggest problem, however, was that even if they allocated 6 seats to each faction, there would still be 2 seats left to fight over. Because of this information, the chief sighed that such a fact greatly complicates the current state of affairs, with which the employee had to agree. And then he added that it was for this reason that the guilds had not yet been able to come to any compromise. Then the man adjusted his glasses and continued his report with the information that because of the rank of this dungeon, the chance of finding rare items in it is greatly increased. And since it has only 1 level, the efficiency of clearing it is also quite high. The warden listened to his subordinate and clasped his hands together, then began to reason rather tiredly that the guilds would probably not concede to each other, because all of their members were simply overwhelmed with self-confidence, though many of them don't even realize what can happen in the dungeon. And then the bearded man loosened his tie altogether, and added that all these players already reminded him of a pain in the ass. Next, the gray-haired man rubbed his forehead tiredly, and asked if there was anyone who was not a member of one guild or another, but had applied for the remaining 2 seats. The answer to this question was no, to which the chief stared at the ceiling and muttered thoughtfully that it was understandable. After all, there's no telling what might happen to you if you enter a dungeon without a group. The phone call interrupted the boss's not-so-happy musings. As it turned out, Mr. Yong-Won Park was on the other end of the unseen line, waiting to talk. The manager raised his eyebrows in surprise at the news, as the situation with the new location was already complicated. At the same time, the bearded man picked up the phone and said that he was listening. But then he dazedly interrogated something, and then practically shouted the name of the new member of the Phoenix Guild, from whom, as it turned out, too much trouble had been coming lately. After that, the older man began furiously questioning exactly what it was all about. The office worker angrily questioned whether the conversation was really about an overzealous rookie, and even blushed with anger. But then his emotions faded into the background, for his boss had just finished the phone conversation, and added that he would get back to him later. The manager immediately asked what happened and got the tired answer that Woo Jin Kim wanted to take the remaining 2 spots without the knowledge of the other guild members. And the warden went on to elaborate on his own idea that if it really is about the newcomer, then the rumors about him really aren't true. And since he always goes alone, the other groups won't be too worried. The subordinate responded by asking if the guy had now become a member of a group of players named Yong-Won Park. However, he could not get an exact answer from the boss, because the competitors could easily use the player to sweep the dungeon, and then get rid of him. The secretary then adjusted his glasses and clarified what would happen to the remaining 1 spot, and whether other factions would fight for it. However, the boss replied that Yong-Won Park would agree to cede it to the other factions if the Phoenix Guild provided him with a newcomer for that raid. so they would simply mediate between the two remaining guilds. The man went on to argue that their competitor was an amazing strategist, and the fact that Woo Jin Kim was an ace up his sleeve was very surprising. However, sometimes it is better to back down to reap the greatest rewards later. But there was only one question, and that was exactly how the newcomer had met their rival. Meanwhile, Kim's secretary asked his superior why he had decided to accept the application of a player named Woo Jin Kim. The man with the scarred face first snickered questioningly, then pointed to his guild's blacklist book and explained that he'd had fun watching the guy make his way over here to bring such a thing, and it just so happened that there weren't a lot of good guys left. Besides, the boss was confident that he could manipulate the new guy and then get rid of him at any moment, and it would happen the second the young player stopped being useful. An hour ago, a conversation of a different nature was taking place within the walls of this office. Yang Won Park picked up the diary with the black list of his guild members and asked if his interlocutor knew what it was all about. Woo Jin Kim answered in the affirmative, and then added that he had already looked at the contents of the shabby book. After that, the office manager asked why the guy had come to him in the first place, and whether he was going to blackmail him and get money too. The man then smiled predatorily and asked if the guest was sure that blackmail would work on a player named Yang Won Park, especially with such a thing that the newcomer himself had brought into his office. At the same second, two rather imposing-looking guards hovered over the guest. However, the brunette did not pay much attention to such a frank demonstration of his own abilities, and instead told the owner of the office that he came here with a proposal, not blackmail, and then began to tell him that now everyone is talking about the AK Ranked 1 story, Dungeon, and that he himself would like to get into it. Yang Won Park was visibly surprised by such an answer and even asked what his visitor meant at first. Then the man gave a loud snort and then laughed out loud and added that Woo Jin Kim was really funny. And then he stared at him with a prickly squint and asked if the visitor understood what kind of dungeon it was to say such things to him. He scratched the back of his head and nonchalantly replied that he knew what he was talking about. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, because the Phoenix and Messiah guilds are competing for this location, because it has a limited number of seats." The man with the scar on his face was surprised by this remark, because the man who knows this information expressed his desire to go to this place, despite the possible risks to his own person. Then Yang Won Park loudly slammed the diary Woo Jin Kim had brought him onto the table beside him and added that his guest appeared to be a real lunatic. Next, the head of the office grinned bloodily and agreed to the visitor's offer. However, at the same time has a counter-condition to him, which must be fulfilled. The building of Gangbu University was illuminated by bright sunlight, but in one of its many classrooms, a lecture was taking place at the same moment. The lecturer went on to say that everyone present in the room now must be aware of the contents of the dungeon report. However, there are at least 1,000 orcs in this location. However, their number could be an order of magnitude higher. Woo Jin Kim listened to the speech with a completely calm expression on his face. From the other players, however, he did not sit, but stood at the end of the hall and propped his back against the wall. However, when the information that in past attacks on the location about 70 people survived, and half of the participants did not return from it, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully and began to speculate that only elite players from each guild gathered here. After all, given this fact, it was impossible to say that all the casualties arose only by fighting monsters. Next, the boy continued to watch the lecturer with an attentive squint and thought about the fact that he had previously had to turn a blind eye to such statistics for lack of evidence. However, the chance that the struggle was not just with monsters, but also among players. After all, it was a good opportunity to get rid of opponents and steal valuable items. Then the brunette in his usual hoodie moved to leave the auditorium, and at the same time began to reason already about the fact that in this dungeon there was a reward for killing an orc warrior. That is, the boss of the location. The Fang of the Orc genus Eventually, the prize was given to the Messiah Guild for its enormous contribution to this sweep. In the past, Woo Jin Kim knew nothing. But when he thought about it now, he realized that it was very strange. It was quite possible that Si-Jun Lee had already been involved in corruption at that time. After a few seconds, the boy left the lecture hall and walked down the bright corridor. At the same time, he was thinking about the fact that even if the head of the Messiah Guild was behind this incident, that the commercial organization itself had nothing to do with it, and that instead of directly influencing it, it had infiltrated spies in other guilds, and that now he needed to predict their next move based on his own memories from his past life. A huge portal to another reality glowed brightly with blue flames. A rather large crowd of players gathered in front of the location, and then all of them were ordered to enter the dungeon. At the same time, representatives of the Messiah, Phoenix, Lion, and Skull guilds had significant differences in appearance, as each participant wore a uniform, the color and cut of which depended directly on the affiliation to one or another organization. Woo Jin Kim, on the other hand, stood out noticeably in his casual clothes. Though he wasn't bothered by that fact, he walked toward the portal too, and adjusted his hood as he went. And at the same time, he thought that he would prefer to rip the orcish fang right out of the hands of his former leader. A bright blue flash of transition illuminated the forest, which was located in the dungeon. A warrior in heavy armor and a sorceress with a staff in her hands began to speculate about where the members of their guild were now, because with all those people around it was almost impossible to find them. However, they were interrupted by the head of the Messiah Guild unit. The player gave the order to line up, and his subordinates fairly quickly emerged from the crowd. The other members of the sweep had never seen anything like this before. Some looked at the picture with disapproval, some with surprise, and some did not hide their own delight and began to say that such a thing could be expected from the Messiah, that such a result was fantastic, and that the guild was praised for a reason. Such talk was rather quickly interrupted by the players, who appeared rather skeptical. After all, the fact that someone was the first to speak did not mean anything in this location, since the entire area was swarming with thousands of orcs. As if in confirmation of these words, the first orc appeared in the clearing near the portal and roared furiously, as he saw the strangers in his territory. From among the fighters in light armor, one stepped forward and declared that the Messiah would deal with the unexpected enemy, and let the others watch it carefully. Then the player activated the skill Vivacious Fighter, and it ended in a successful provocation. Next, the fighter gave a bellicose cry and slammed his shield to the ground, causing a wave of dust to rise, and an expression of malicious surprise on the face of the orc. Then the orc rushed to the warrior, and with all his inhuman strength, hit him on the shield with his fist, and then tried to throw the player aside, causing more dust and rubble in the air. The orc roared in frustration over his own failed attempt, while his opponent snidely clarified whether that was all he was capable of. In the next second, the sorceress joined the fight, her eyes and palms glowing with golden fire. The girl used the skill Lord of the Source of Wisdom. Moreover, she managed to restrain the orc, which was firmly entangled by numerous fetters that burst from somewhere under the ground. Then the glow around the sorceress intensified, and the dark green ropes reached the monster's neck and began to choke it, causing the orc to clutch at them with his hands to relieve the dangerous pressure. Then he wheezed and bared his huge fangs, which spurted out in thick foam. But further into the forest that densely covered the entire dungeon, there was a loud noise, and the ground beneath the player's feet shuddered sensibly. The less experienced members of the sweep began frightenedly asking what it was, and shouting about an earthquake. However, their more experienced colleagues countered that in all likelihood the cause of the sound and vibration was somewhere behind the forest. They prepared their weapons and waited tensely for who knows what. And then other orcs poured into the clearing they were in. A battle ensued, the air filled with the stomping of monsters, screams, snarls, and clinking of weapons, and blood poured to the ground, tearing off the sharp blades with every blow. Next, the battle was joined by mages whose hands burst into flames of gold, visible even in spite of the clouds of dust that rose into the air. After that, a cry resounded through the ranks of the Messiah Guild warriors that the time had come, and it was time to move forward. The warriors followed it and rushed at the orcs. Meanwhile, on a branch of an old tree that grew nearby, Woo Jin Kim was nestled. He watched the players battle with the monsters, and concluded that, just as he thought, no one had noticed his absence. Next, the boy smiled contentedly, for now it was time for his turn. Woo Jin Kim stood on a tall tree branch and watched the battle between the four most famous guilds and the orcs, and came to the conclusion that the enemies would not be able to push the players back to that extent. Then the lad pushed off the branch on which he had previously settled and jumped to the next, for in this way he could avoid moving on the ground, and, as a result, unnecessary meetings with the inhabitants of this dungeon. And in the process, he began to reason that he should take advantage of the situation and locate the warrior orc. Under the terms of the dungeon cleansing, it was necessary to get rid of the warrior orc and thousands of his subordinates. Guild representatives will first try to reduce the number of rank-and-file opponents to reduce their own losses. However, after the elimination of 1,000 orcs, the players will begin to look for the boss of this location, and until that moment, he must have time to get the warrior orc Fang. With this thought, the necromancer continued his movement between branches, and smiled in anticipation of the future venture. The high peaks of sharp rocks stretched toward the full moon from somewhere behind the forest. Among these stone claws was the camp of the orcs, and the shelter of their leader. The orc warlord sat on his throne, presiding over the trial of one of his subjects, who had been defeated in a skirmish with the gamblers who had come to cleanse him. The monster was now on its knees, awaiting its fate, arrows protruding from its body, blood streaming down its chin. Then the other orc roared and swung his stone sword, causing blood to gush onto the stone floor and the hapless fellow to fall breathless. The rest of the monsters roared and stared at their leader with eyes that lit up with fierce fire. He, in turn, gripped the armrest with his fingers, then stood up and raised his axe above his head, before roaring loudly. A huge number of monstrous enemies moved away under the orders of their ruler, and Woo Jin Kim, who was watching the whole scene from one of the cliffs above the enemy camp, concluded that following the orc who had escaped from the battlefield was a good idea. Then the guy watched directly for the boss of the location that he and the other players had to clean up. He looked stronger than the necromancer had imagined, but he had sent his minions to fight the guild members, so luck was on the brunette's side now. Next, the orc warrior returned to his seat and climbed onto his stone throne, causing clouds of dust to rise into the air. And the necromancer smiled predatorily and thought that while the others were fighting on the front lines, he could get close to the main enemy while he was alone and strike first. Meanwhile, the battle in the clearing, where the players had reached immediately after the transition between realities, was over. The commander of the Messiah Guild looked at the mountains of green-skinned bodies, leaned on his sword, and declared that the orcs were not so difficult to fight, and that it was time to move on. This decision was due to the fact that there were fewer opponents than he had expected, and, in all likelihood, their main forces are in another place. Then, however, the warrior was interrupted. A scout came to him with a report that many new orcs were heading toward the players. The warrior inquired about the number of enemies, to which he received the answer of about 1,000 enemies, and by all appearances, that was their main force. Next, the commander turned to the other players who were in the clearing, including those who belonged to other guilds, and began to tell them that, as he thought, they should all stop at today's achievements. After all, it would take a lot more equipment to go up against the main force of the orcish army. But then the man was interrupted by the angry cries of those who disagreed with such arguments and declared that the representatives of the Messiah Guild were nobody and had no right to order them around. As it turned out, the Lion Guild members opposed the arrangement proposed by the fighter in the light cuirass. They confidently declared that they were not Messiah's dogs and intended to continue the offensive. The Messiah squad leader gave the daredevils a disapproving look and proceeded to explain his advice by stating that many orcs were headed their way. And while competition between the guilds was important, without harmonious work, they would all perish in this dungeon. However, the commander of the Lion Squad echily clarified why their competitors are so unsure of their own strength. After all, if they were so afraid of ordinary orcs, then they in principle should not have entered this location. Then the golden armored warriors moved forward, while the Messiah warriors stayed in the same place and looked at them for a while. After which the scout said that these players were real self-righteous idiots, and the squad leader instead offered to find a safe place to rest and prepare for the next battle. Woo Jin Kim cried incredulously that this could not be, and a look of great surprise appeared on his face. Meanwhile, the orc chief once again prepared to attack. However, the second skeleton roared angrily, and his eyes lit up like ball lightning. Then the dungeon boss struck again with his weapon, sending a column of pebbles and dust flying into the air. But he couldn't hit it, and the servants started running around the orc, which made the orc even angrier. However, the dark-haired mage who brought the undead back from oblivion understood that the skeleton warrior would not last long, and his only chance was to attack now, while the last skeleton distracted the orc chief. With that thought, the boy raised his bow and took aim, then released a poisoned arrow from the bowstring, and it flew toward the enemy, who at that moment was just trying to hit the overly dexterous servant of the necromancer with an axe. Except that things did not go at all the way the young player had planned. Instead of becoming an easy target, the orc leader turned around and managed to dodge the projectile at the last moment, first bewildering the necromancer, and then realizing that he had underestimated the enemy's strength. Meanwhile, the skeleton tried to use the tactic of chopping the legs of an opponent who was many times his size. However, after another such strike, the servant's sword simply broke, unpleasantly surprising the dark-haired wizard. The next second, the main enemy dropped his axe on the skeleton, causing the undead to literally crumble and scatter in all directions in small shards of bone. After that, huge orc stared burning with anger at player, who could only take his bow, and then he caught himself at the thought that it would be difficult to get out of the situation in which he was now, and most likely a change of plan would be necessary. The orc warrior stood beside his throne, and the magical fang-shaped necklace still hung around his uncircumcised neck. Woo Jin Kim had to point out the fact that it was useless to fight the boss while such a powerful artifact was in his possession, especially since his level of magical power was not enough for a full-fledged fight with the enemy. So this time, the player chose to prudently retreat, while noting that the orc warrior was not pursuing him for some reason. Meanwhile, the monster didn't even turn its head in his direction, and the necromancer surmised that it probably seemed too troublesome for him to pursue a retreating enemy. Though that was to be expected for an AI rank dungeon boss. The boy smiled, for the circumstance played into his hands and gave him the opportunity to hide freely. But when he returned, the monster would regret having let his adversary go so easily. Then Woo Jin Kim climbed up the tree again and began to move rather quickly through the branches of the area, which was overgrown with forest. His silhouette was noticed by the other players, and they began to discuss who exactly they had just seen. As it turned out, they were members of the Lion Guild, and the head of their squad bellowed angrily that it turns out they weren't the only ones who left the battlefield. Then the other warriors joined in the conversation. They suggested that perhaps this member of the mopping up found the orc warrior faster than they had managed. However, the commander began to explain to his subordinates that this theory may or may not have been correct. After all, No one knows for sure if he is going back because he found the warrior orc. And then he added that they should not blindly believe anyone until they have seen the main adversary with their own eyes. After that, the red-haired man began to reason that the item that falls from the dungeon boss of rank A should belong to the Lion Guild no matter what. But then his emotional speech was interrupted by a sound that caused the commander and his chief aide to look around. Then, one by one, the men fell to the ground, and pools of viscous blood swarmed around their bodies. The commander's face froze with horror, and then he started screaming, trying to understand what was going on. Then the man gripped his sword more comfortably and rambled on about how he'd heard nothing about any other monsters than orcs in this location. And he added that they couldn't possibly be monsters at all. But, as if to refute his words, the darkness between the trees flashed with the twin lights of someone's eyes. Then the gambler screamed frantically for his adversary to show himself, and whether he expected to be safe after all he had just done. But the red-haired fighter's desperate cry was interrupted by a thunderous growl. Meanwhile, in another part of the dungeon, in one of the many caves, a fire was burning. Woo Jin Kim headed towards its light, and saw other players inside, huddled around the fire. The lad saw the other members of the sweep, and was relieved to think that there were no guilds here that might be interested in his person. But then he noticed the gloomy faces and stiff postures, and noted that from the atmosphere in the cave it looked as if he were at a funeral. However, after a couple of moments the brunette stopped and understood the reason for the gloomy mood of the other players, as he saw many fresh graves and thought about how many people had ceased to exist on the first day of the raid. Next, the necromancer began to observe the other players, and thought that something was clearly wrong. Even though there were only soldiers gathered here, they were all well prepared, and most likely the battle between the guilds had already begun, just as he suspected. Meanwhile, the players who were sitting around the fire began to talk among themselves. There was talk about how some of them looked awful and had apparently overdone it, despite their own abilities. However, the observation that the same could be said of all who were present followed in response. However, the Heishi Guild representative was indignant over this wording, because he was sure that their organization was the most alive. Then he asked if there was any news about the members of the other organizations. Next, a blonde warrior entered the conversation and began to tell what he heard, as if the greatest losses suffered by the Lion Guild. Their group went into the woods to retrieve items, but disappeared. He was interrupted by a dark-skinned warrior who protested that not one group was missing, or even two, and then he asked if it was possible at all. The answer was yes, because the bodies of the players were so badly damaged that they could no longer be recognized. And in general, orcs make a living out of eating people. Meanwhile, someone mumbled about how awful it was, and even if he ceased to exist, he would not want to become food for monsters. However, the pessimist was immediately interrupted, because if you talk about such a subject, it could become a reality. Next, the players stared into the fire and began to speculate that what bothered them all was how strange things were. After all, if this had been a normal mission, there would have been far fewer casualties. No one could disagree with that fact. So they talked about the fact that maybe at least someone would survive this sweep. After all, human life should be placed above objects and the like. Woo Jin Kim sat a little aside from the other players, listening to their conversations and thinking that, given being in an 8-ranked dungeon, such a development was quite possible. However, the chances of so many groups being wiped out in one day are not that high, so there is definitely something behind so many missing participants, and his plan could fail if the soldiers became weaker. And then the necromancer decided that starting tomorrow he would work harder to solve this problem. The bright morning sun was rising over the dense forest. At first one could not suspect that the forest was in fact teeming with hordes of orcs, whose roar caused flocks of birds to fly frightened into the area. The monsters were all moving in the same direction, and that made the players, whom they were getting close to, nervous with anger and fear. But the panic was quickly suppressed by the commanders, who reminded their less experienced subordinates to keep quiet and concentrate on the battle. A wave of green-skinned men moved toward the players' squad, and then the monsters roared viciously to intimidate their human opponents. After which a battle ensued, and the battlefield was covered with the dust that was raised by thousands of pairs of feet. Woo Jin Kim stepped away from looking at his inventory window and turned around to look at the flock of birds that had flown away fearfully because of the noise that had risen in the dungeon because of the battle, and noted that the main battle with the main orc force seemed to have already begun. Next, the boy went back to his work and at the same time thought that his problem at the moment was the impossibility of striking the warrior orc as effectively as possible with the items he now had in his possession. Then player remembered how the skeleton servant he had summoned broke his sword after hitting the dungeon boss, and then he himself crumbled into tiny crumbs under the monster's huge axe. This circumstance made the use of the undead as bait unsuccessful because they were too weakly resistant to physical damage. But after that, the necromancer wondered if the skeleton warriors could shoot an arrow. And to find out the answer, the dark-haired mage began to summon a new acolyte. The orc warrior sat on his stone throne, holding a huge axe of sharply honed stone in his hand. And then Woo Jin Kim, armed with a long sword, appeared in his field of vision. He noted that the monster seemed perfectly calm today and inquired about the start of the second round of their confrontation, to which the location boss growled angrily and activated the fang that hung around his neck in the form of a pendant. Next, the artifact flashed bright blue fire, and its owner jumped on the player, sending a wall of dust and small stones into the air. Seconds later, however, the monster roared as blue lightning whizzed past it, and then shielded itself with an axe from the arrow someone had fired at it. Then someone else attacked again, and the orc warrior looked around with eyes glowing with rage at the area he was on. It appeared that two skeletal servants, armed with bows, were firing at him. Then the monster swung his axe and ripped a large stone from the ground, which immediately flew into the wall above the heads of the skeletons, causing the bone fighters hurriedly run to the side and on the move shot again at the orc. He repelled both blows with his axe again, while Woo Jin Kim jumped over his opponent's head and noted the fact that, just as he thought, skeleton warriors also knew how to shoot an arrow. So it was definitely going according to plan, which made the guy smile predatorily. Woo Jin Kim swung his sword and tumbled in flight, then darted past the warrior orc, startling the monster and cutting the lace of the necklace that was hanging around his neck. Next, the monster turned its head toward the insolent player, and the pendant slipped from its place, and the necromancer simply caught it in flight, causing him to immediately see a status window, which informed the guy about receiving the Orcish Lord's fang, and the space around it lit up with sapphire fire. Meanwhile, the loss of the artifact weakened the orc warrior, and his strength and defense diminished. The monster roared and struck with an axe in front of him. But Woo Jin Kim managed to dodge the attack. But the beast itself had no time to do this, and a second later, two poisoned arrows stuck in his knee, which caused the hemotoxin to enter the body of the enemy, and immediately began to take effect. The dungeon boss turned around and saw that the skeleton warriors had managed to hit him after all, and the creator smiled, for the warrior orc's fang was now in his hands, and his attacks against the green-skinned man were now more successful. Next, the player looked closely at the artifact in his hands and opened the status window, which reported that during use, the Orcish Lord's fang increased stamina by 30 units, and increased attack and physical defense strength by 5% of the total. After that, the necromancer got the Lord Orcish Fang Holder achievement and activated the item, causing everything around him to burst into a blue glow, and he thought to himself that now there was only one thing he had to do. and that was to get a weapon that could take the dungeon boss's head off. To do that, the brunette cut his palm and smeared blood on the blade of his sword. Meanwhile, the skeleton servants again fired at the green-skinned leader, and he let out a loud roar and at the same time began to deflect more shots of bone warriors. However, one of the throwing projectiles still hit the monster between the ribs and caused him to get more blood poisoning. At the same time, Woo Jin Kim rushed out of his seat and where he had been standing a moment before. A blow from an orcish axe came crashing down, and the necromancer somersaulted again, in flight, and thrust his sword into the monster's body, inflicting further hemotoxin poisoning. The orc roared angrily and dropped his axe, which made his opponent smile. The weapon fell to the ground beside the skeleton servant, and the undead's eyes immediately flashed with predatory fire. And then the bony fighter dropped his bow and picked up the heavy axe, then lunged at the main monster of the location. And his maker thought it would be the perfect weapon to decapitate the boss. The desperate roar of the main enemy was heard by the scout. He began to look around for the source of the strange sound, because it was not a scream that ordinary orcs make. Then the blonde-haired player raced toward the sound, thinking that perhaps someone nearby was fighting a warrior orc. In such a situation, it was necessary to immediately figure out who this guy was and report to the guild as quickly as possible. So the scout accelerated, and after a few jumps along the branches of the huge trees, he found himself at the edge of the stone plateau. There he saw 2 skeleton warriors and 1 gambler who had already almost dealt with the main boss of dungeon, but he could not feel the presence of anyone else. And this fact indicated that the strange man is fighting against the orc champion alone. Such a scenario was almost impossible, so the scout decided to immediately report what he had seen, the guild command, and hastily rushed away, causing a mocking smile of the necromancer, who noticed him. However, just as the blonde-haired gambler jumped up to climb a nearby tree, his little flight was interrupted by an arrow that pierced the unlucky fugitive's shoulder. Next, the scout collapsed on the ground and looked around, trying to figure out exactly who had attacked him. Then he remembered the picture on the rocky wasteland and thought that someone must have seen him. And it was probably an asshole who didn't want him to blab about how someone had killed an orc warrior. But then the boy saw some movement behind him and turned around. And then he saw the figure of some fighter, whose clothes were glowing with a ghostly light. From the mask on his face, the scout could tell that a Skull Guild fighter stood before him. But a second later, his existence was terminated by a sneaky sword blow to the back, and viscous blood poured from the wound to the ground. Guys, please like and subscribe to my channel if you like manhwa and everything related to it. I would also be very pleased if you could write a comment. Thank you.